This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
Still on the conversation this morning, the Federal Executive Council, FEC, has approved the disbursement of 60 billion naira from the Central Bank of Nigeria to boost small business growth, particularly among young entrepreneurs nationwide. The funds will offer vital support to businesses that are run by young entrepreneurs, providing significant relief and helping them to fortify and expand their businesses. And while this approval has been met with optimism in most quarters, there are still some questions regarding the policy document that validates the disbursement of the funds. Our guest this morning on the conversation is Enterprise Promotion and Development Professional Celestine Okeke. In a conversation with Radio Now, Mr. Okeke starts by sharing his reaction to the news of this disbursement.
So my reaction would be in the same perspective of you have shared before now on government-supported or government-sponsored intervention for MSMEs. I do not consider any of such interventions capable of making any impact in the absence of a policy document that I can look at and then have understanding as regards was the frame, was the scope, was the objectives and the rest. Frame in terms of, is it sector-wide fund, sector-wide in terms of all sectors can apply. What category of MSMEs are? Is it for startups or is it for new, existing or established enterprises? And then implementation framework or implementation document that tells me this is what government wants to do, this is how it wants to achieve it. In the absence of all of this detailed information, it is practically impossible for me to speak to any government-sponsored intervention. I did share a report I co-authored in 2019 on how corruption negates government-sponsored intervention for MSME. This is a recurring problem. You don't just say you want to release X, Y, Z amount of money, regardless of whether it's billion or whatever amount. No. What is the framework? Just give us something we can work with. Where is the policy document? As I speak to you now, was there any review, any evaluation of past interventions to say, okay, we have learned from the previous ones and this is how we do it better? I didn't see any of that. I haven't seen any of that. What we have in the media space is that government is launching XYZ billion amount of money as intervention. Besides that, what else can we speak to? What else do we know? What else? Is there a policy document? Is there a document where you can go get detailed information? Who's going to implement? How are they going to implement? What's the focus? What's the expected outcome and all of that? It's not in the public space. And without that being in the public space, it's practically impossible for anyone who wants to make an informed opinion or informed contribution to do that.
Right. Well, there are quite a number of figures being thrown around with this latest intervention. One of which is that the original fund, which was established in 2020, amounted to 75 billion naira, with plans to release 25 billion naira annually. But you have specifically mentioned that there's no policy document here. But in this iteration, I should say, we were hearing about the plans to have a sort of a legal framework for guiding how the investment fund will be disbursed and used. Does that give you any sense of hope that a different approach will be tried this time around?
So I would throw it back to you more like a question, which would have made more sense. Developing and validating the legal framework before announcing the fund, or announcing the fund and then telling us we are going back to do the legal framework, which would have made more sense. It would have made more sense if you and I or every other stakeholder in the sector had a couple of conversations around stakeholder engagement, around doing evaluation of past programs and learning from them, and then saying, okay, out of what we have learned from the previous intervention, including the infamous 220 billion MSME fund at the CBN, we are launching this program development policy that will enable us to have the legal framework, the legal and managerial framework And then the legal and managerial framework would then say, okay, we think it makes sense to start with a 1 billion or a 2 billion, and we think it makes sense to start with the agri sector, or start with the small scale industrial sector, or start with the services sector, or start with the renewable energy sector, which would have made more sense. So obviously, if you ask me, it would have made more sense if all of this groundwork were done before telling us that you are now you put the cart before the horse. You've announced the intervention amount, and they are going back to now the legal framework and the rest. I don't think it makes sense.
Well, perhaps it's more a sense of them putting both of these things in place at the same time, because the same announcement that talks about the approval from the FEC is the same announcement that talks about the legal framework being put in place. Isn't it possible for it to work without, as you have opined, the legal framework existing before the announcement of the release of funds?
Well, how do you confirm the existence of a chain if you can't access it? If you are not told where to find it, and especially for an intervention program, if there has not been series of conversations around how do we refine how we develop or implement government support, if there has not been conversations around what we did wrong with the previous intervention and what we would do right with the future intervention, if we have not looked at the current state and said, okay, the current state has these limitations, we are going to build a future state, how else can you speak to the existence of a legal framework of an implementation framework if there is nothing? When I say nothing, I haven't heard of any conversation, I haven't heard of any stakeholder meeting, I haven't heard of any public hearing, I haven't heard of any stakeholder contribution, I haven't heard of any moves towards developing a legal framework and an implementation framework. And if they had same, you would expect that at the point where they were mentioning the funding, they would have said we have developed or we are in the process. Is it stakeholder enabled process, or is it to be done by a select government agency? We don't have all of that. And if you do have that information, I would love to get that from you.
Well, Mr. Okeke, I certainly don't have that information. But before we wrap up this conversation, I reckon it has to be asked, if there is a legal framework for this document or a policy document in place, would this sort of fund actually have an effect on MSMEs?
Okay, so merely having a legal framework or an implementation framework will not guarantee effect. What would guarantee effect is the process through which the frameworks were developed. Is this stakeholder? Was it co-created between public and private sector? Did it have input from key stakeholders? And then what is the implementation vehicle? How do you want to implement? What agencies are you using to implement? And then stakeholders will go back and say, okay, we do have some level of confidence in the capacity of this stakeholder or in the capacity of the organization to drive the implementation. So it's not entirely about if we now have the legal framework or the implementation framework, if it do the magic. No, we would have to look at the entire process that led up to developing the legal framework, implementation framework. Look at the stakeholders who would manage the fund. Look at the capacity. Look at the level of transparency and accountability mechanisms built into it. It's a whole lot of value chain, and if you miss one step, having the document may not guarantee anything.
Mr. Okeke, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you. Yeah.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.